The Cure of Ars. Chapter 7. The Chaplin of Ars. It is true that there was not very much love of God in the forgotten village of Ars. There had indeed been a time before the crime and scandals of the Revolution when Ars had been a parish and had known its years, perhaps its centuries, of vigorous religious life. In the 18th century, if we may judge by the contemporary survey of church-going, religion was very much alive, and fraternities were flourishing. Ardent priests, such as the Abbé François Hescal, had defended and indeed strengthened the hold of the faith. The storm had broken. There had been an end of priests, and the end of the sacraments, an end of every kind of religious ceremony. True, the old folk had done something to keep belief alive, and when from time to time a priest made his appearance in what they continued to call the parish, they filled the church with tears in their eyes. Little by little, however, these sturdy Christians of the old days died out, and the adults who had been the young people of Ars under the Revolution had slipped into indifference because they had never been taught to understand their religion. As for the younger generation, they thought of nothing but pleasure, with a few splendid exceptions, families whose names still survive at Ars. An icy chill had touched the souls of the villagers. The Abbé Vianney had an almost physical impression of it at the moment he came into contact with the village for the first time. On the evening of Wednesday, February 9, 1818, immediately after his morning mass, he had left the Eclé Presbytery and set out on foot, followed by a charter who was bringing his clothes, his books, and the Abbé Bailly's bed. An overcast sky, heavy with mist, added to the desolation of the already melancholy countryside. As he descended one more cart-track, the new chaplain of Ars, or the Curé d'Ars, as we can surely already call him, saw the light of a few narrow windows glimmering through the fog. That was it. There are new parish priests, who find enthusiastic crowds waiting to greet them, a forest of friendly hands outstretched to grasp theirs. For him, there was no one, except perhaps at the chateau, who even knew that he was coming. Not a soul in any case was waiting to greet him. The moments he saw the lights which told him he was entering his parish, he flung himself on his knees to implore the help of his guardian angel. The first place he went to was his church. It had a narrow nave with a low roof and a circular choir, and there were no side chapels or steeple, for the latter had been destroyed by the revolutionaries in 1793. But the thing that chilled the Abbé Vianney's heart the most was to find the lamp before the sanctuary out and the tabernacle empty. It was not yet light the next day when he set himself to work. After a long prayer, he began his ministry in Ars by celebrating Mass. He himself tolled the Angelus, and at the call of the single bell, suspended from its crazy rafters, a few devout women had hurried to the church. Then the young curé had rekindled in front of the altar the lamp that was henceforth never to go out. There was hardly a single bright side to the situation in which the new chaplain found himself. Strictly speaking, his title should have been that of assistant priest, since his chapel of ease came under the curé of Miserio, and the Abbé Vianney received what had become an assistant priest's usual pay in the re-established church, 500 francs a year, paid by the local administrative unit, the commune. Ars had ceased to be a parish, but it still counted as a commune, and by the grace of God had returned as its mayor a good Christian, a Monsieur Antoine Mandy. There was also a parish council, but the annual accounts of the chapel of ease of Ars were no trouble to understand. The year of his arrival, the Abbé Vianney carried out 6 baptisms, 2 marriages, and 3 burials. The next year, in 1819, baptisms increased to 12, and there were 5 burials, but no marriages. In 1820, there were 13 baptisms, 4 marriages, and burials nil, and so it went on, with very little variation. As can be imagined, the fees at Ars amounted to very little. If we look at the accounts that the Abbé Vianney drew up later, at a time when the Chapel of Ease had become a parish again, we find that in 1831, for example, the receipts at 115 francs were 13 francs more than the expenses at 102 francs, while in 1832 there was a deficit of 35 francs, receipts being 76 francs and expenses 111. It is hard to believe, but down to the year 1859, the year of the curé's death, the parish of Ars accounts more often than not showed a deficit. The Abbé Vianney, however, did not worry his head over these material details. From the very moment of his arrival, the question he had asked himself had been what he could do for souls of the village. Éclay, he told himself, was too big, and just for that reason I shouldn't have liked to stay there as a curé. In this village, I've got exactly the job I need, and in any case, it is God who has sent me here. People talk a lot more ill than good of my poor parishioners. That only means that there's work to be done to make them better. Most of them don't know the way to church, or have forgotten it. Whatever the cost, I must get them here. And to do that, after all, haven't I got a prayer at my disposal? From now on, the house of God remained open to him night and day, and the Abbé Vianney became its constant guest. For how can a priest accomplish his pastoral task better than by praying? Rising very early, he would light himself with a lantern to his meeting with God. The way from the presbytery to the church at that time led through a corner of the courtyard, and the curé gave thought to the dead. Then he entered the sanctuary, and under the dim light of its perpetual lamp he offered up his soul of a priest, whose burning love was another, if less visible, flame in honor of Jesus present in the Eucharist, prostrate on the flags at the foot of the steps leading up to the altar. He would recall one by one the mercies of God, would praise him and bless him, and then, his body racked with sobs, would intercede for the souls of Ars. My God, he would cry, grant me the conversion of my parish. There were people whom curiosity led at such hours noiselessly to open the door of the church. A man who lived close by, a witness has related, wanted to know what the Abbé Vianney was really doing so early in the morning. He found him praying, and when he came back he told his neighbors, "He's not a man like us." Indeed, the new chaplain, as a woman parishioner put it, seemed to have taken up his abode in the church. He was there before daybreak. He only came out when his duties called him, and he stayed there till the Angelus sounded in the evening. All the same, the Abbé Vianney, who, as Count Prosper Desgratz de Ars testifies, set to work immediately to make his parish completely Christian, was at pains always to accompany prayer with action. That is why he made a point of calling on those of his parishioners who refused to call on him. The population of the village consisted almost entirely of farmers, so the only moment he could pay his calls was at meal times. That was hardly the sort of time one could have chosen for spiritual talks or reminders of the other world. But following in the footsteps of St. Paul, the young curé had made up his mind to be all things to all men, to talk about the weather, the ploughing, the crops. His language was as simple as his manners. He introduced himself to people without affectation, with a cordial handshake, a friendly smile. If occasionally he was ill-received, which was exceptional, he was able to contain his feelings, for he was by nature quick-tempered, born, as one of the witnesses of his remarks, with an impetuous character. He had already acquired sufficient dominance of himself not to let his irritation appear. It was rare for him to leave a house without saying a few words about God and religion. He would give an affectionate blessing to the younger members of the family and would ask the parents to be certain to send their children to catechism. Going about as he did, the Abbé Vianney soon won the sympathies of his parishioners, and there was hardly a Sunday when a new face was not to be seen in church. The Curé de Ars paved the way for these timid returns to the faith, which would soon be sincere conversions by his opening contact with his people. And he consolidated the successes by prayer. But he became convinced that the complete transformation of his parish demanded something more. What that was he indicated later on to a priest who came to him to complain of the disappointing results of his missionary work. "You tell me you've done everything you can think of to convert your parishioners," the curé said. "But have you fasted? Have you used the discipline on yourself? Have you tried sleeping on bare boards?" He himself practiced these cruel penances to a degree rarely seen since the days of the Desert Fathers. The presbytery was a peasant house built of the local clayey mud. On the ground floor there were 2 rooms. One of them was the dining room, and the other, paved with large irregular flags, could serve at the once as kitchen, storeroom, and box-room. The upper floor was divided into 3 rooms, of which the nearest to the church had been the bedroom of successive cures of the parish, and the other 2 could be used as spare rooms. Finally, the garret above was itself divided into 3 parts. The Abbé Vianney, however, did not dream of spending the night in the room intended for him. Sometimes he would sleep in the corner of the damp, cold ground-floor room, whose flags he would cover with a thin layer of straw, mixed with vine shoots. Sometimes he would choose a space in the garret, where he would lie on planks, with a log under his head for a pillow. But even this could not satisfy his thirst for penance. The Curé de Ars subjected himself to the most savage abstinence. In Holy Week that followed his arrival in the parish, he only ate twice. There were other times when he remained for several days together without taking any food. He wanted to make expiation for the souls in purgatory, to call down divine mercy on them. That did not end the story either. He needed an almost superhuman energy to hold good in the midst of his solitude. Far from his friends of the old days, and from the family he never thought to see again, but his friends held more than endurance and strength. There was love there, too. And because there was love, he felt the call to offer himself up, for God and for the good of souls, on the pattern of him who loved to the point of giving all his blood. When night fell, the Curé de Ars would regretfully leave his church for his room. There, in a little box which was a mystery during his lifetime, and which has been preserved, were hidden away his iron disciplines, chains, at one end of which was a ring through which to put a finger, and at the other a bolt or a key. It was with one of these instruments that night after night the Abbé Vianney would flagellate himself, sometimes to the point of losing consciousness. In the corner of his room, opposite the door, if you lift the blue and white striped serge curtain that covered the wall from prying eyes, you would find that the plaster is splattered with bloodstains. You can see how the blood spurted under his lashes, how blood stained the hands of the ascetic, whose prints can still be seen, how blood flowed from the ravaged shoulders with which he leant against the wall, how the blood trickled down in fine threads to the floor. Here was the price of souls. When he had done, the saint, for all his exhaustion, would lie down to sleep, not in a reposeful bed, but on the damp paving of the ground floor, or the boards of the garret. Later in his life, unbearable attacks of Later in his life, unbearable attacks of neuralgia caused by what he would laughingly refer to as the follies of my youth forced him to go to his room to sleep, but even then he would only tolerate the thinnest of mattress in his bed, and between the sheets and the mattress he slipped a board plank. Chapter 8. Converting the Parish. Ours was a victim to three besetting sins: religious ignorance, the passion for pleasure, and Sunday work. The new curé set out boldly to attack these three great evils. It is in his church that a priest teaches his people. The appearance of the Ars church, however, was both mean and unattractive. The walls were peeling, the woodwork was faded. There were none of those statues, gilt or blazing with colors, which fascinate the eyes of the young and the poor. The flat roof, which stretched a bare 21 feet above the single nave, was crisscrossed with cracks and stained with the leakages of many past downpours. And when it was not possible even for ceremonies to be beautiful, for the state of the vestments for the Mass and for Vespers was enough to make one weep. The Abbé Vianney's dreams did not rise to replacing the building, but he did try to make it less unworthy of its divine host. A detail that speaks to his supreme devotion to the Blessed Sacrament was that he insisted on beginning with the high altar. He got a more handsome one from Lyons and paid for it out of his own poor stipend, helped by the lady of the manor, Mademoiselle de Ars. He bought for vestments the best that could be got. Naturally, the story got around. People came to have a look. And as they could only have a look on Sundays and feast days, these occasions saw a fair congregation at the services. That gave the Abbé Vianney the opportunity he needed to go into the pulpit and teach his people. And his words were so clear and so forthright that within the week every detail of his sermon, repeated from mouth to mouth, had made the round of the parish. As he was talking chiefly for the benefit of those who were not there, everyone in Ars, whether they wanted to or not, was certain of hearing his teaching. It may be asked, what was the usual subject of his sermons? First of all came the duty of attending Mass, and the place of the Blessed Sacrament as the center and the food of any Christian life. Then followed the great truths of the faith, the immortal destiny of the soul, the heaven that could be won, and the hell whose mouth yawned, the hatefulness and the terrible consequences of sin. The Abbé Vianney followed to the letter the advice of St. Paul to Titus. Be strict in taking them to task, so that their faith may be soundly established. Strict the curé certainly was, while sin continued to hold ours in its grip. He had to shake the good out of their easy-going outlook if he was to break down the final defenses of evil. For this insignificant chaplain of the last village in the department had set no ordinary aim before him. He was determined by his personal virtues and his apostolic labors to convert and to save every single soul in his flock. The Curé de Ars had a special fondness for the children. Up to his arrival, they had, for the most part, been completely neglected. There was no school except in winter, when the teacher, who was a farm laborer for the rest of the year, opened a mixed class for boys and girls that lasted for 3 months. Despite his efforts, very few children learned to read. Winter was also the season for catechism classes, but since the children whom their parents designed to send could not read the lessons in the book, they were merely bored. The others ran wild or stayed behind working on the farms. It was just as difficult to get them to Mass on Sunday. The youth of ours was a youth without God. It was heartbreaking for the Abbé Vianney to have these facts borne on him. But his mind was made up at once, till the moment arrived when it was possible to open church schools, and that moment would not long be delayed. He would do the work himself. If the pupils of the catechism class could not read, he would teach them. Patiently he set about it, with no book to help him, mingling with his lessons all the most beautiful stories from the Bible or the lives of the saints. And it was not merely once or twice a week he taught. It was every day, Sundays included. From All Saints' Day to the moment of the First Communions, there was a catechism class every day at 6 in the morning, with only pictures given as prizes to the most punctual and the most attentive. In the midst of his children, the Abbé Vianney forgot a good deal of his severity, and soon, one attracted by another, all the children of an age to communicate, had rallied round their parish priest. A few years later, the Bishop of Belley, who had come down for a confirmation, declared after questioning them at length that the children of Ars were the best taught of the whole countryside, while priests called to the bedside of the sick people who had come from Ars were astonished to hear such humble Christian talk of religion with so much knowledge and understanding. The second sin of Ars, a natural consequence of the lapse into religious ignorance of a place once so fervent in its faith and so honorable in its conduct, was the frenzied pursuit of pleasure. Naturally, the evil was not universal. Some families stood out as islands of faith in the midst of the mass of indifference, nor had it as great a hold on the old folk or the people in the prime of life. With most of the young men and girls, however, it was, witnesses have affirmed, a veritable rage. It had gone to their heads. The granddaughters of the Christian housewives of pre-revolutionary days, who, a contemporary curé testified, made their regular meditation and kept the feast days with great devotion, had become no more than pagans whose moral sense was so blunted that they accepted real crimes as the most ordinary thing in the world. The Cure d'Ars sadly bore witness that among the inhabitants of the village, practices that were in honor in the high days of paganism were being brought back to life. Dances were the chief occasion of sin for them. In this part of the country, popular festivals go on all hours. The very feast days of the local saints have degenerated. Here is an example of what is still going on today in a commune next door to ours. It is an extract from a poster which does not refer either to the patron saint or to his mass, but which is headed, all the same, Patron Saint's Day, Saturday at 9:30 p.m., great torchlight tattoo, Sunday morning from 7 o'clock on, concert by military band. Afternoon at 3:30, great public dance, which is the principal item in the program. At 9 p.m., resumption of the dance till a later hour of the night. Monday after lunch, public games at 4:30, public dance at 9:30, resumption of the dance. It needs no Solomon to guess from such a program that the festivities are likely to go beyond allowable pleasure and to offer a genuine danger to the innocent. Slackening moral standards and declining faith are natural sequels, and ours by no means confined itself to the yearly celebration of the feast or its patron, St. Sextus, when there was a series of dances in which people from all the neighboring communities joined in. There was hardly any occasion that did not provide the inhabitants with an excuse for dancing. On ordinary Sunday afternoons, men and girls dressed up, the village cafes were filled, and then couples would set about organizing an open-air dance a few yards away from the courtyard and the church in a little square lined with walnut trees, to the tune of some local violinists. Whether it was in a room of some local inn or in a barn, proceedings would only end, to quote the words of the poster already cited, at a late hour of the night. That was not all. The inhabitants of Ars had thrown themselves with such wholeheartedness into their favorite enjoyment that their village had become a rendezvous for dances for miles around. Naturally, they were asked back, and they did not miss a single one of the patron saint's days. In the neighborhood, it is easy to understand the sorrow the curé felt when he looked on at such extravagances, and the energy he threw into fighting them. He was convinced that the souls of his children were at stake. The evil was a deep-rooted one. So, in his war on impurity, the Abbé Vianney was utterly uncompromising. He bound himself not to lay down his arms until he had won an outright victory, and he kept his word. In the pulpit he was never afraid to call a spade a spade. Maybe the dancers were not in the church, but at least some of their relatives were there. The parents who did not look after their boys and their girls were the first to need a lesson. If their children took the path to perdition through their negligence, what a cursing responsibility was theirs. "Depart, accursed father and mothers," the Abbé Vianney cried. "Depart into the hell, where the wrath of God awaits you, you and the good actions you have done, while all the time you have let your children run wild. Depart into hell. They will not be long in joining you there." The curé deliberately spoke in terrifying images, which could not fail to make the culprits think, when they were repeated to them, "The devil surrounds a dance, as a wall surrounds a garden," he said. And again, "People who go to dance leave their guardian angel at the door, where the devil takes his place, so that there are soon as many devils as dancers in the room." "My God," he said once more, "can a man's eyes be so bewitched as to believe that there is no evil in dancing, when it is the cord by which the devil drags the greater part of his souls to hell?" It may be asked why the Abbé Vianney was so implacable in his condemnation of a physical recreation which St. Francis de Sales describes as being in principle morally indifferent. The reason is that, and here is another quotation from the old-fashioned language of the kindly Bishop of Geneva, "according to the ordinary manner in which this diversion is carried out, it deposeth and inclineth gravely towards the doing of evil, and is by consequence full of danger and of peril. Now it is morally impossible that dance that go on far into the night, and that take place in a semi-darkened room, even if they are not indecorous in themselves, shall not become evil, and thus a grave cause of guilt. For first, they are immediate occasions of sin, and secondly, some people go to them for that very reason. It is why the Abbé Vianney refused absolution, even for a single lapse, to anyone who had danced, and was not absolutely determined to shun all dances in the future. There were Ars girls who had waited for absolution for whole months in this way. When they finally surrendered and became converted, however, the transformation in them, their enthusiasm for well-doing and for a Christian life, had to be seen to be believed. When he deprived them of the sacraments, their parish priest had forced them to search their hearts. They conceived a horror of passing pleasure, and a completely new life opened before them. Naturally, the Abbé Vianney came up against resistance. More than once he had recourse to a trick or a piece of bluff to gain his ends. One feast day, when there was a dancing in the air, he took the offensive, placing himself on the route by which the violinist would come. He stood and waited. "How much do you get for playing at a dance?" he asked the man on his arrival. The violinist named a sum, and the curé promptly paid him double. The musician immediately retracted his steps, delighted at his excellent stroke of business, and the dancers, who had already gathered on the square, stood about kicking their heels and ended by dispersing with a hangdog air. On another occasion, the stern parish priest merely appeared as a dance was beginning and showed his indignation, and the gathering broke up at once. It took the curé de Ars more than 10 years to completely wipe out dancing in his parish, but almost from the beginning he had won the more modest girls to a Christian life. When the few scapegraces who stood out wanted to get up a dance, they could only count on unfortunate farm hands or strangers to the village to help them out. By the time that what was called the pilgrimage had started, the constant coming and going of people of every country who had flocked to Ars to see and to hear a saint, the battle was won. The Abbé Vianney had become such a king in his parish that, even if there had been nothing else, the mere idea that it might cause him pain would have been enough to prevent the least unseemliness. The saint waged a war just as bitter against the cafes, which were habitual meeting places of the dancers, and which on feast days and Sundays were deadly competitors of the church. One after the other, the 4 publicans of Ars had either to put up their shutters or change their job. Later, as we shall see, quite hostelries were set up where the pilgrims could get a simple bed and board. With the tipsy song of the drunkard, blasphemy also disappeared from the streets and the houses of Ars. Blasphemy had infected even the children, who had picked the habit up out of mere imitation, understanding nothing of the vile words they innocently brought out. The Abbé Vianney mingled tears with his entreaties in such a way as to fill them with horror of it. The day came when they could be next to certain that the name of God was never pronounced in Ars, except when it was pronounced in prayer. Another evil, the third sin of Ars, which also called for long and arduous battles before it disappeared, was the desecration of Sunday. When he tackled this subject for the first time from his pulpit, the Abbé Vianney spoke with a sorrow and a saintly indignation which profoundly stirred a congregation that was still but a sparse one. His burning enthusiasm soon led him to more direct action. He fearlessly bearded the violators of the divine commandment, the men who, when they carted their manure, their crops, on a Sunday afternoon, were carting their souls to hell, robbing the Lord of the day he set aside for himself. He would sometimes go out after vespers on the paths where he was likely to meet the Sunday workers. He could already claim at least an acquaintance with them, since he had called on them at their homes. Doubtless it was annoying for them to be caught in the act of sin by this priest for whose character, whatever else they might think of him, they had the highest respect. But after all, St. Paul recommends his beloved Timothy to preach the word of God, dwelling upon it continually, welcome or unwelcome, bring home wrongdoing, comfort the waverer, rebuke the sinner with all the patience of a teacher. It was thus that one Sunday in July he saw coming along the road towards him a cart loaded with sheaves, which seemed to have no driver. The man was trying to hide himself behind it, but the Abbé Vianney had recognized the beasts and called him by name, and he had no choice but to come into the open. "My dear fellow," the priest told him in a gentle voice that trembled with feeling, "you think you've been properly caught because you've found me here, but God sees you always. It's of him that you must be afraid." Little by little, the inhabitants of Ars learned to understand their duty, and with very few exceptions, faithfully observed their Sunday rest. All this is looking ahead, however. For the moment, we are only at the beginning of the Abbé Vianney's work in his little chaplaincy. The year 1818 had already brought about striking changes in the moral life of the population. a stone cross set up that year on the road that leads to Savigny, the nearest adjoining parish, is still there to speak of what was probably a first reawakening of the faith in souls that had been so long sunk in sleep. Towards the end of 1819, a missionary from the Carthusians of Lyons came over on the Abbé Vianney's invitation to give a mission in the Ars church. Another priest of the same order had already preached there in the course of the year, and his sermon, as the saint wrote to the superior of the Carthusians, did a lot of good, which, he added, makes me very hopeful that you will convert the people. But almost 10 years have to go before the triumphant exclamation could be uttered, "My brethren, ours is no longer ours." And we'll continue this story next Sunday. Thanks for listening.